Maureen Maher is an award-winning investigative journalist. She spent the last 18 years at the CBS News magazine 48 Hours, dedicated to finding the truth and seeking justice. Her reporting has helped change international adoption laws, put a serial killer behind bars, and cleared the names of 2 men who were accused of a vicious crime, one of whom who had been wrongly incarcerated for nearly 25 years. Full disclosure, I first met Maureen at CBS News in the 1990s. We immediately connected through our mutual love of storytelling and have been close friends ever since. Welcome, Maureen, to our podcast. How are you today?
Well, thanks for having me.
So we usually start at the very beginning. What did you think you were going to be when you grew up, Maureen?
I think by the time I was in grade school, I wanted to be a writer. And then as I moved through high school and discovered the broadcasting opportunities in high school where they had me doing the daily announcements and writing for the newspaper, it was always geared towards writing, news, storytelling. I think originally maybe I thought it would be fiction for the writing part, but then news really took over when I was in college at Loyola University. I was the morning anchor on our radio station that broadcast in Chicago. And the night that the Gulf War really started, I remember being called at 2 a.m. and then saying, you need to come in and prepare because we're going to be doing all news on the morning drive show. And the adrenaline that hit with the ability to get the information as quickly as possible and then to disseminate it as quickly as possible, which is why I originally loved radio, really latched on that night. The immediacy of news through radio initially and the ability to convey people's stories, what was happening in other parts of the world to the location I was in was pretty powerful.
Do you remember any specific stories from back then in addition to the wars? I'm assuming it was the first Gulf War, right?
It was the first Gulf War. That's how old we are, Claire. It was the first Gulf War, and everybody can do the math now. I think what was very profound to me at that moment was I was dating somebody who was Jewish. And he lived in New York, and he happened to be in town visiting on the very night that the Scud missiles were flying back and forth. And to see how upset he was, to see him on the phone with his mother and father back in New York, knowing that they had family in Israel, really brought home the impact of the ability to convey information. As I mentioned earlier, I just think that the stories of people's lives, to be able to relate his experience on the newscast that morning, to say I was sitting with somebody who had family in Israel,
right,
was very powerful.
Yes.
You feel like you're there, and you feel the ability to connect people. That, to me, has always been the most important part of news, is to connect people. Yes, it's to disseminate information. If there's a crisis going on, like we would cover hurricanes and tornadoes, you had to get that information out immediately for people's safety, but also to relay what's happening to other people and to bring in the listening or the viewing public to bring them into the story and say, somebody needs help, or this is what's going on, and maybe you have a similar situation. I really think it's the ability to connect people is the most powerful and important role that news and storytelling can have.
And you went on from there. Yeah, I remember covering a hurricane or two with you and some other stories. And then you went on to be a crime reporter, for lack of a better description, although there might be one. And I know that, at 48 Hours, where you ended up for a very long time, each of those stories is horrific, tragic, always sad. How did you connect with those kind of stories?
I think it started, growing up in Detroit, in the suburbs of Detroit, there's an enormous amount of crime in that city. And I started out as a radio news reporter in Detroit, covering a fair amount of crime. Then I went up to Flint, Michigan, where when you go to Flint, Michigan as a young reporter, you have 2 paths to take. You're either covering General Motors and the UAW, or you're covering crime. And I did not really plan on staying in Flint all that long, so I did not want to invest in the time of GM and the UAW, and that was very much a man's world. It was men who were running those organizations, and it was men who were covering those organizations. So I, having street experience from Detroit, decided that crime would be where I would focus my attention. That's the first place I really became, for lack of a better phrase, what we used to always call an ambulance chaser. And I think those stories always stuck with me because it's 45 seconds in radio, a minute 20 on television if you're covering it for a daily broadcast, but there's way more than a minute 20 worth of emotions in every one of those stories. And we would be standing at a crime scene for a day, and then we'd spend the next couple of days trying to track down family members in the story. And then I think that was one of the great parts of being in Flint, was that I would cover a case from crime scene to sentencing. The turnaround would be within a year or so. It wasn't years and years and years the way it can be now, where a defendant is waiting or delaying the process, which just happened with the Gargiulo case that I've been covering since 2008. But in Flint, I could be at the crime scene, cover it, engage with the family, and then within a certain period of time, I was in the courtroom watching the process unfold to the prosecutor and the defense attorney's eyes, and the puzzle of putting the case together, and still being there with the family and talking with them every day. Working in a smaller market gives you access to people because they see you. They know you're local. And you don't become a part of the story, but you're right next to it. So I think that really set the stage for me. And then moving on to CBS News as a breaking news correspondent with more of that. And finally, the 48 Hours, where it's been a privilege to be a part of these people's lives. It's not easy, but if the question is like, how do you deal with that? It's still about the story of people's lives. You know, true crime has become a commodity. It is a business now. There are dozens and dozens of shows. There are movies. There are books. I was just looking at the New York Times book review, their summer suggestions, and the top 10 are all crime related. Right. Somebody said to me, well, who reads that stuff? I'm like, apparently a lot of people are reading that stuff.
I know.
But it's really because it's how the story is told.
It's funny because I do think that's something that's evolved really over the last 10 years. I don't think it was – I don't remember it being as big, 20 years ago. That's definitely an evolution of reality television and things that have changed. In your assignment, one of the things that people may not realize, but when you are working for a show like 48 Hours, you are part of a team. And it takes a team to put the story together, people who touch it at different stages. And as the reporter, it's all your work, but there's so many people that are part of it, and you have to disseminate all of the viewpoints, all of the people, all of, everything. What is it like being a part of that team? What are the advantages and disadvantages from the reporter's perspective?
From the reporter's, well, I think it depends on the reporter. There are some reporters that look at those team members as working for them, and I think that those are seasoned reporters who've been around a long time and they know exactly what they want, and that works for them. For me, an editor at our Dallas bureau once said to me, every single person on the team, every member of the team is responsible for bringing something different, something unique that no one else will bring. And so on one particular story, that might be the ability to talk to the family and, for lack of a better phrase, convince them, get them to trust you to sit down and tell their story. That I've worked with many families prior to us sitting down where, I meet with them, we have dinner, we go out, we spend time talking. Certainly in the last year or so, I've had to do that over Zoom, which made it more challenging. But some people really want to talk to the person who's going to be interviewing them. And I'm not a well-known person necessarily, but 48 Hours is, and within that world I am. So some people want to have a conversation with you before. I've been involved at that point. I've been involved where I just drop into the seat and I introduce myself and we start talking. And what I bring there is the interview. the skill of the interview and the questions and the way in which the questions are asked, the ebb and flow of the interview, and then you have a producer who has set it up. So I think outside of the specific roles of editor, where they're putting their hands on it, the role of producer, associate producer, correspondent, that kind of interchanges depending on what the story calls for.
Right.
If a producer is nursing a case for 5 years, like there were two gentlemen that were wrongly convicted in Indiana, the producer on that piece had nursed that case for 5 years. I didn't get called in until the last 3 months, but then I drilled in on all the court stuff, and I drilled in on the prosecutor, and I drilled in on the former, the cop who wrongly put them away. Those are the things that I brought there. She brought the other role of it. I think it can be very beneficial. The team is like a family that works well together when you have a similar viewpoint. When you have a different objective, when other people on the team have a different agenda, that makes it incredibly difficult. There's nothing wrong with having different viewpoints. It's good to have a different point of view, but when you're
healthy. Yeah.
Right, it can be healthy, but if your agenda is different, or you dig in, it, as you would imagine in any family, it causes great consternation. I always describe working in news. It's like Thanksgiving Day, where like you love seeing some of your relatives, you haven't seen them in a while, you love hanging out with them, and then there's like crazy Aunt Betty and weird Uncle Al. You know, there's just people that you don't get, don't understand, don't necessarily want to be with more than once a day. In a big environment like 48 Hours, any of the news magazines, or a newsroom, there are people you're not going to get along with. There are people you're going to love getting along with and working with.
You just hit upon something that I always have been fascinated with, because I worked in longer format, but for me, those segments were, less than 15 minutes. Maureen, sometimes you go and you get to meet with people before you actually begin gathering the elements and before the camera shows up. So you get to have relationships with people and begin to start to develop to know them before you have to actually sit down with them and interview them. And that, to me, is just such a luxury. I always worked on shorter broadcasts, which weren't an hour of one story, so it didn't get that capability, I guess is what you call it. So things are revealed and facts are unfold during those first moments. And then, they kind of continue to be unveiled, especially when on 48 Hours, the trial happens and things come out in the trial. And how do you stay with the story and report the story as things change, and how often is the final piece really different from that first initial meeting?
I think you have to look at any of those relationships the same way that you would look at a relationship with somebody you're meeting. I don't want to necessarily say on a social level, but when you meet someone, if you knew them before or you knew something about them before, you go in with a preconceived notion of who you think that person is. Then you meet them at a dinner party, you meet them at a gym, wherever it is you meet that person, even if it's in business, you meet them at a business meeting. Then you spend more time with them. And those preconceived notions, which we always as correspondents get notes, usually on who the characters are, what the case is. You get a little biography on each one of these people. And it's either because a producer has pre-interviewed them or they've gathered information from a daily news outlet that was covering the murder or a missing person. So information is given to you beforehand. Then you sit down and you start talking to them. If we no longer have quite the amount of time to cover a case because true crime news and shows has become so competitive, and the overlap to infotainment has been really dramatically increased in the last few years. We just don't have the amount of time because there is an impetus to get it out and get it on the air, and it's very competitive if it's a really big case that everybody else is covering. But the way it had worked for a very long time, which was, as you said, a luxury. And what I enjoy the most about it is I do get information beforehand. Then I sit down, and like I would with anybody, I ask questions. I want to get to know the person. And in the course of a general conversation where you don't come off as that you're fishing for something, you're just generally trying to get to know somebody. you find things out about a person, whether it's somebody I met on a plane or somebody I know I'm going to be interviewing or want to interview. And I am notorious for revealing part of my life as well, because you're asking these people at their most vulnerable point in their life, whether it is a survivor, a victim's family member, law enforcement, which there's a very combative role now, relationship between law enforcement and media, which is so disturbing to me because they can work hand in hand, and yet there's this dynamic now where somehow they've been pitted against each other. Everybody involved in these cases has given a piece of themselves to it. It is a passion. You are not a cop if you're not passionate about it. You're not a lawyer if you're not passionate about it. And then there are the people who've been personally impacted by it. I think you need to respect that people give of themselves in these positions, and so it's okay to give a little bit of yourself. You have to be human if you want some humanity in the piece. If you want people to respond to you, you have to respond to them. So I always have welcomed the opportunity to go to dinner before or get on the phone and talk to them. And that allows me to connect with the people. And I tend to be very involved in my cases. Most people don't know this, but for the nearly 19 years I worked at 48 Hours, I was actually a freelancer. I picked and chose many of the pieces I worked on and the teams that I worked with. And because I wasn't picking out 5, 6, 7, 8 shows a year, I could do 2 or 3 shows, which gave me time to get to know the people, to know the case. And probably the last big case where this is true, it was Mary Louise Day. It was a story of a 12-year-old girl who goes missing. And for the better part of 5 years, we were working in tandem with 2 police officers, 2 detectives, who were determined to find all the information on this missing child. They were convinced she'd been murdered by her stepfather. And all of their information checked out, and we believed it. We were working in tandem with them. And then it turned out that there was a small piece of information they'd left out. But that piece of information that they dismissed was the key to discovering the truth about what really happened to this little girl. So all along, we were working with them. We believed it. We thought it was all true. We did our own work. But once we had that piece of information, it changed everything. And we had to take our investigation in a different direction. Right. We did not end up being at odds with the cops. But it was tough because we knew that they had made a mistake. And they were good detectives. But they'd made a mistake. So you have to follow it through to the end. That's probably the best case I can come up with, where I thought one thing for 5 years, and then a piece of information led us to the truth.
That was the Mary Louise Day case?
The Mary Louise Day case that aired in May of 2020. And we've been trying to get it on for 7 years.
And Maureen, when you're putting together a script and you're sitting down and it's a blank slate and you have an hour of television to fill, do you look at how do you do it in your head? Are you looking at the moments that stayed with you, perhaps during the interview? And that's what you write first? Do you write it in order? Do you go to and kind of put the ending together first? How do you shape it, and in what, what's your strategy for putting a script together?
I would be remiss and also immediately called out by every one of our viewers, as well as those of the who watch Dateline and 2020 and all the other shows, if I didn't cop to the fact that there's a bit of a formula now in the way in which we put our shows together. But we have 6 acts at 48 Hours, and the first one is just laying out a synopsis of the story. It's the tease of what the case is and who are the voices that you're going to be hearing from throughout the next hour of television. And usually Act 5 is the trial, and Act 6 is the reaction, the response, and kind of mapping it out. But what happens in Acts 2, 3, and 4 is really where we are laying out each individual story. What are the unique aspects of each case, of the people who are involved? Who is our voice? Who is our storyteller in this hour? Is it a mother? Is it a father? Is it a detective? Is it a prosecutor? Is it a private investigator? Is it a best friend? It's always somebody different. And they really kind of guide the way that person, the person who's our most, the most realistic, the person you can connect to, someone who's willing to give of themselves in front of the camera, the storyteller, the narrator. That can guide the way in which we put the story together, but it always comes down to, in these cases, the facts. Do we do it sequentially, or is there a red herring in there, or do we do it the way the cops did? That really depends on each case. That really changes with each case. That's where the team comes into play, because you have to decide on how you want to structure the piece. You have to decide whose voice is going to come in and when. And if you can't agree on that, the rest of it will be a battle. But most of the time, it's pretty obvious the way in which a story should be laid out, because we've been on it for so long. We've been thinking about it while we were doing interviews and listening to people. And when there's an aha moment for us, we know it's going to be an aha moment for the viewer.
One of the things I'm always fascinated with is you're sitting in front of someone and you interview them and you feel it's compelling and you go into the edit room and it is compelling. But sometimes there's that moment which is so, wonderful, and maybe one of the reasons why I know I do this, and I think you do too, is you've interviewed someone and you get in an edit room and you start to look at it and you didn't realize at the time how powerful it was, or you see something different in the edit room. They become more interesting or more, an important part of the story.
I'm really deeply invested in my interviews, much to the editor's dismay, because I don't think that most people know I look at it as a privilege, but there's 42 minutes of actual television in 1 hour that is broadcast. The rest is commercials and announcements, PSAs, marketing, etc. So in the 42 minutes of television, you figure any one person might get 10 or 12 minutes of actual talking airtime, as it's divided between the correspondent speaking, different characters talking, video that's playing. And that, it's hard to imagine that's been whittled down from an hour, 2 hours, sometimes a 3-hour interview. So I've always sat down. Anytime I sit down, I ask them, the first question is always the easiest. Please tell me your name. I might make them say their name 3 or 4 times just until they get comfortable. They're the most comfortable words that can come out of somebody's mouth is usually their name. And then I tell them, we're just going to have a conversation. I have always been far less concerned about having a television perfectly worded question than I am about having a conversation. Most people I have ever spoken to or interviewed in the process of putting together 48 hours or a long-form piece, they forget that the cameras are there. I want to have a conversation with somebody. I don't want to be ever heard saying, wait a minute, did you just say the sky is blue? Really? What color was the sky when you looked at it? I don't care really what my question sounds like. I want to try to ask questions that I know people at home are asking, the things I'm curious about. I do have a list of questions in front of me, especially if there are facts that we have to get to and we're talking about the case specifically. I have to get to those. But they're more likely to come out in a conversational way if you're having a conversation. And in my head, I have kind of a weird ability to bookmark things that people say. I don't write down what they said in the middle of the interview, but I remember exactly what they said. And we will be writing our scripts and the producer will have written something and I'll say, but wait a minute, what about when they said this, this, and this? And the producer will say, well, I don't remember that. I'm like, I'm telling you, it was right around this time and I asked this question, and they'll go back and say, yeah, I didn't mark that when we were in the middle of the interview. But now that I've gone back and looked at it, it was a really good conversational moment where the two of you were just talking and you really get a sense of truth and honesty from this person. Those are the moments, so to speak, that I'm going for. I'm looking for somebody to give me their honest emotion at that time. And in order to get that, I have to be honest with them. I can't give them a canned television question.
What have been your favorite stories to tell over the last, 10, 15 years? Which ones stick out?
Everybody asks that question. I try to answer that question this way. If you were a patient going to see a doctor and you asked your doctor, who's your favorite patient who you pay the most attention to and give the most of your time, every patient would want you to say them. They would want your full attention and time and expertise devoted to them. I try to do that with every case, so I don't really have favorite cases. The cases that I most connect to and the ones that stick with me are the ones where people really gave of themselves and were really trying to do something good, or there was a horrible injustice and we were really trying to do something good. The cases that have been with me the longest aren't necessarily the ones that I walk away feeling great about. You know, it's sort of like when you see a movie like Saving Private Ryan. You want to have seen Saving Private Ryan, but it's so gut-wrenching. That's not something you say, I really enjoyed it. So that's how I feel about these cases. Like the Gargiulo case, Michael Gargiulo is a serial killer who was recently finally sentenced after being arrested in 2008. It took until 2021 until he was sentenced. And I am very deeply involved in the case. We brought a witness forward after we ran the first show in 2011. A witness came forward, and I turned him over to Cook County so that they could finish their investigation and charge him from a case from 17 years earlier, which was then connected to a case in 2001, and another case in 2005, the arrest in 2008. It just went on and on and on. And then I was asked to be there for the sentencing. And it was a profound moment to be there, but it's not a good moment, you know. It's good that justice was served, but you don't feel good walking out of there when there's so much carnage and so much pain. But I think they all stay with me. What's hard for me are the crime scene photos. I always look at the crime scene photos, not because I have some macabre interest in them, but it's so important for those of us who work in true crime to remember, yes, it's true crime. Yes, it's a television show. Yes, it's turned into a business. But at the very beginning, this is about somebody who lost their life. And these people had someone who loved them, and they lost that person, and they are stuck with that loss for the rest of their lives. And we have to remember that first, that if you're going to tell the story, you have to know the whole story.
Right,
you have to stick to the story.
Yes, so important. When you first started, or maybe later on, are there voices in your head of other influential storytellers? And when I say that, it could be broadcasters or, just things that have affected you so that they come out in your work?
Yes. I mean, I will say one of my least favorite things to do is the ambush. I know that that's a caricature of reporters, that they're running after somebody with a microphone and trying to stuff it up their nose. I've done my share of them, but they are reserved as a last resort. And my very first one I had to do for 48 hours, before 48 hours went to all crime, was a porch collapse that happened here in Chicago, where a handful of people died, and the landowner would not answer any questions, wouldn't get back to us. And for legal purposes, we had to have it on camera that we did try to contact him. And I was quite nervous about doing it. It was my first ambush for 48 hours for a network show. And I remember thinking, who at 60 Minutes that I've seen do this does this in a way where you can't be gracious, but you can be professional. And so there are a couple of people in my head when I have to do something like that where you know you're not going to get an answer from the person. They're not going to turn around and suddenly decide to talk to you when you've been stalking them through emails, phone calls, and knocking on the door for 3 months. And now you have to get them on camera saying no comment.
And I do think people need to understand that really when you're doing that, you're validating that, it's like your insurance policy. Yes, we did try to reach you. In some sense,
but that's not our first, right? That's not our first choice. That's not our first recourse.
Of course not.
We don't
Never.
get a story and run out and bang on the door.
Right.
That's the last thing that we do, and it has to be timed. We want to make sure that if the person is a parent, that there are no children around. We're not doing this at the child's school. It's all very well thought out. And so there are people who have done it with some class, because they know they're not going to get anything, and they just walk up and they say, I'm so-and-so with such and such. We'd like to ask you some questions. And that's as confrontational as you need to be in those situations. But you have to be prepared for it to turn, because sometimes they do become extremely combative. So I think I looked, when I started out, certainly at 48, when you move from genre to genre, different, if you're doing radio or television or breaking news or evening news or war coverage, every time you are entering into a new realm of coverage, it's smart to look around. Who are the people that you respect? You're not necessarily trying to emulate them, but you can take notes on the way in which they do it that represents journalism at its best.
Right. I do think some of the best writers do talk about how there is a voice in their head. They're thinking out loud. Or some of the best television writers, I should say. There are just voices that you think of who might say this.
So I think producers who are writing words for other people to speak, they have a voice in their head. It could be the correspondent, or it could be a former correspondent or a broadcaster or a writer that they are trying to emulate. But I think for people who are broadcasting and on air, maybe they write with a different voice, but you should be speaking from your own voice. You should be using your own voice to tell the story. I don't think you should be trying to sound like somebody else. You should use your voice. It should come from you. So if somebody else is writing for you, you should go back and change the words so they are your words coming out of your mouth.
That's a good point.
The times that I speak to young people about it, I always say, look, management is going to come and go. Executive producers are going to come and go. Producers are going to come and go, with all due respect.
I know.
But
Coming from a producer.
Reporter, yeah. Well, I don't produce for other people to speak my words. I produce for me to speak my words. Or I'm choosing a clip, and because I've been on air for so long, I'm very careful about the sound bites that I choose. I don't choose the most salacious sound bite. I don't choose often the sexiest soundbite or the best TV sounding soundbite. I choose the soundbite that is most reflective of that person. Whatever I took from that interview is what I want to convey in the piece that I'm putting together, because I have to, bring it down to just a very small amount of what the actual interview was. And if I'm writing for myself, it's my voice. And Dan Rather once said something to me, which is, at the end of the day, it is your name, it is your face, it is your voice. I don't care who investigated, who wrote it, who brought the story to you, who's the executive producer, who signs your paycheck. At the end of the day, it is your name, your voice, and you are responsible for what goes on the air. And you better be able to draw your own line in the sand if you disagree with any of those people along the way.
I think people think that who watch television. I think people in television can sometimes forget that. You have done true crime for so long, but when you have off time, what kind of stories are you reading? What kind of films, whatever you'd like to. I always ask people, I find it interesting to see what they are interested in when it's, their own time.
Well, for better or worse, I kind of gave up fiction a long time ago, just because, when I was younger, it started with Nancy Drew, it went to Trixie Belden, then I graduated to Amityville Horror and a bunch of other things in between, and I read a lot of, there really wasn't true crime back then. I read a lot of Stephen King, Mary Higgins Clark, I read Grisham. I read all of those until covering crime and going in as deep as we do at 48 Hours, where I am looking at the crime scene photos, I just could not view or read or watch anything that was like that, because I would get an image of an actual crime that I covered. One night my husband really wanted to watch Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, because he'd read the book, and I said, I'm not reading the book because I cover those things. And he said, well, the movie's supposed to be very good. And we got to the part where there's a woman in a cage, and I'd already been like covering my eyes for half the movie. And I paused and I said, what in the hell? Come on. And he goes, I didn't know it was going to be this bad. And I said, but wasn't this in the book? And he said, yeah, but it wasn't the focus. I'm like, there's a woman in a cage. How is it not the focus?
Right.
And he said, I know, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was that bad. I've gotten up and walked out of movies if there's too much violence. It's not that I can't take the violence. I just don't see any point in the entertainment value of it. Now, that said, in my house, especially during the pandemic, Marvel became our way of life. And you can say what you want about Marvel and Star Wars and all the fantastical science fiction stuff, and there's plenty of violence in it. But it's not the kind of violence that I cover. And the storytelling, you asked me, like, what stories, I don't read Marvel comics, but I read them with my son. And the storytelling is pretty fantastic. It's not War and Peace. It's not going to win a Pulitzer. But it really draws in a child. And that whole genre, where entertainment, books have kind of failed at this, and that having a family move forward together in a storytelling project. Now, my husband read every Harry Potter out loud to my children starting before the pandemic, and then they finished during the pandemic. And then we watched the movies together, and it was a joy. And my kids are older. They read plenty on their own. I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and he was still reading to them, and we still read things together. But it's hard to find books that you can pull a whole family into.
Right.
So I think movies do a better job.
Yes.
Some of the movies do a better job of that. But personally, for me, I am a big nonfiction reader. I love biographies. I love the true stories of people. I love to see how they navigated challenges in their life. I draw total inspiration from those kinds of books, where, you know, as you know, as a storyteller, it's the story of somebody's life. What could be more fascinating than that? Truth is always more interesting than fiction.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Maureen, I thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and really good luck as you continue to tell stories.
Thank you so much.